Okay. All right. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to the Middleton Library tonight. We are so excited about tonight's presentation. I just want to thank Badger Talks. They provide a whole host of speakers free of charge for the library, and I know many of you have enjoyed these lectures before. This series takes the Wisconsin idea at its starting point and aims to promote lifelong learning, intellectual curiosity, and engagement between academics and the community as a whole. So thank you for coming tonight. My name is Liz Zimdars. I'm the head of adult services, and I am pleased to introduce Franciska Coleman, assistant professor of constitutional law and at the University of Wisconsin Law School and associate director of the East Asian Legal Studies Center. Prior to joining the faculty of UW Law School, she was a visiting professor at Washington University in St. Louis and also held a visiting scholar appointment at Harvard Law School. Professor Coleman is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work draws upon political theory, critical discourse analysis, and constitutional law. So please join me in welcoming Professor Coleman.
Okay, I am so not used to kind of a mic that's on a stand, so hopefully you guys, I can project if I'm away from the mic. All right, so I'm so excited to talk about one of my, things that I'm highly interested in. But first, I wanted to allow Jeff Miller to kind of tell you a little bit about what he's going to be doing so you aren't confused.
I can do loud. I'm Jeff Miller. I'm a photographer with University Communications at UW. In coordination with Badger Talks, who's the woman centered here in the dark Fran leads. We're doing a story on Badger Talks, promoting some upcoming programs and creating some visuals with Franciska's permission. I'm just going to be moving about quietly photographing mostly her and kind of from the back, but I want to let you know kind of who I was and what I was up to. I'm not really looking up to make identifiable pictures of people in the audience. If you're comfortable with that, you can give me a flag and say, hey, I want to be in a picture. Maybe I'll think about it. But I just want to let you know who I was. Anyone have any questions? Otherwise, I'll get back to our speaker.
Okay, so this presentation has changed names multiple times because there are several articles that I'm writing about this topic. So the latest and greatest topic is the anatomy of cancel culture, the social regulation of free speech in the U.S. Where am I? Do I need to? Why isn't it? It's not moving.
It's green.
It's green. And I just
No?
oh, you mean like the other pictures you're taking?
Depending if you're comfortable. If you're not, that's fine.
Yeah, I can take you with this one. Just after.
Okay, I'll just do it for you. It's not.
Okay, all right. So, where did this topic come from? So, I was in South Korea, and there was a hate speech, kind of global international regulation of hate speech. And so people were like, oh, the U.S. doesn't regulate hate speech, so just come and, just tell us that. But then around that same time, there was this move to boycott Chick-fil-A, and I thought, even though there is no legal regulation of hate speech in the U.S., something is going on in the kind of non-legal space. In the social space, there's some kind of regulation going on. So one of the things that when I kind of one of the things that when I began to think along those lines, I thought about the First Amendment, which says, you cannot have government regulation of free speech, but it leaves open whether or not you can have some other kind of peer-to-peer regulation of free speech. And I think that that's a deliberate choice of the First Amendment, that we don't want centralized regulation, but we want to leave it to communities and to individuals. And when you think about the goals of the First Amendment, to promote self-governance, right? To promote a marketplace of ideas. All of those things are actually compatible with kind of localized creation of speech norms. So the First Amendment, no legal centralized regulation, but leaves open the opportunity for social decentralized regulation. And so I gave a name, a definition for this social regulation of speech. It's the process by which ordinary citizens in society use their collective pressure on institutions to set and enforce a set of, now it's national, but national or regional speech norms. Okay, so how does social regulation of speech work? Well, first, there is dissemination of the speech. Then there is an accusation. So you have tweet something, you post something on Facebook, you give an interview to Fox News. So there's some kind of way your speech gets out into the public. And then there's an accusation. Someone hears your speech, either directly or it's forwarded to them, and they make an accusation. After this accusation, there is this distillery phase. And so if you guys are familiar, you remember the stocks, you're kind of head your neck there, and people are throwing tomatoes and other unsavory things at you. A similar thing happens in the virtual space, right? Your speech is out there, you're kind of held up before the public for this public vilification and shaming. That's the pillory phase. And then you have the sanction. Like, how does an institution, the institution with which you are affiliated, how does it respond to the pillory phase? Now, if you have an institution that's very liberal, and the people who are throwing, tomatoes at you are also a part of that liberal discourse community, the institution is likely to sanction you in some way, many times it's fire you, right? If, on the other hand, right, the institution is more of in the conservative discourse community, and the people throwing the tomatoes are in a more liberal discourse community, then you may actually not end up being fired. So the sanctions kind of depends on the networks and the community that the speaker is embedded within, and the community that the institution kind of is beholden to in a way. There's this kind of direct action. So this is not a phase, but sometimes people want to amplify the accusation, or they want to kind of amplify the sanctions. And so in that case, people will, not just respond to your tweet on Twitter by saying, "Oh my God, how racist can you be?" They might also march around your job with signs, right, that say, "Oh my God, a racist works here," right? And so that's the direct action. And so people may resort to direct action if they're not getting enough traction, right, just in the kind of virtual space. Okay, so dissemination, tweet, Facebook posts, cable online media. The accusation is normally that the speech is harmful in some way. People normally don't say, "Oh my gosh, this is so offensive." Normally they actually say, "You're harming people," right? "This is racist," right? They use very strong language to make the accusation. And different ways, replying to a tweet, emailing employers, sending letters. I think there was a Netflix incident where there was an internal discussion board to get that accusation out there. And then the pillory phase, public scorn and abuse. Occasionally, there are the people who are like, wait, I don't think they meant it that way. In order to kind of successfully have someone sanctioned, really the most powerful accusers and the most powerful participants in the pillory phase are those people who say, as an alum of this institution, right, or as a student, or as a customer, right? So you insist that, I have a relationship with the institution, and that is viewed as giving a little bit more influence to your claim. No one says, as an unaffiliated individual, I want you to do this, but they always say, look, I have a stake. Maybe I'm giving you money. I'm patronizing your business or your institution in some way. And that's actually what can make or break whether the accusation in pillory phase results in a sanction. Okay, so the sanctions. I've been deeply embedded in reading tweets and statements from universities and companies about what they do in response to accusations of racist speech or of transgressive speech. Normally, the sanctions are resignation. People are pressured to resign. sometimes people are pressured to resign like literally the next day. Like I was so shocked. There was one individual, he had made some tweets that were kind of anti-police like several years before. And he was now working at the University of Alabama, and Breitbart published a study like, who's working at the University of Alabama now? This guy, right, who thinks America is a racist country. And literally the day of the tweet, of the story from Breitbart, he was fired. And so, or he resigned. He was pushed out. But the interesting thing was, if this idea is like relationships between people is what impacts universities to move, I'm like, who at this university has such a deep connection with Breitbart that they are so motivated by their stories? But you have resignations, you have terminations, you have verbal condemnation, and then sometimes you have the clearing of the speaker. But this is actually not always the benefit that it can sound like. Because there was a communications professor at the University of Kansas, and she, I don't know why she did this, but she basically was like, students were talking about like, how should we handle kind of racism in the classroom, and they were having like, students come to us about it. And in the middle of this discussion, she's like, well, I can't really, participate in this discussion, and, because it's not like I see the N-word spray painted on the wall, but she actually said the word, right? And of course, the students were like, yeah, fire her, tweet, hashtag fire, this professor. And so, but actually she was cleared, right? But then she had like a review, and they were like, oh, your research is not up to par, right? And so then her husband is like, no, I don't think it's like the research, right? I think it's that they really wanted to fire her. They couldn't, they didn't want the kind of free speech pushback from like firing her after her speech in the classroom. So they kind of had a different reason. And so sometimes even if the speaker is cleared, later there will be some disconnected, separate reason that causes them to lose their job. Okay, so here is an example. So you have the kind of dissemination. Lisa Greenwood just felt very comfortable like tweeting this herself, like no one stole it and tweeted it later. Like she put this out in the public. And then someone else kind of accuses her. They kind of include her employer, right? Does this lady works for you because she's racist? Okay, so this is the accusation. And then you have the pillory where other people kind of chime in, oh my gosh, she's harmful to minorities, you're going to continue to employ someone who's racist. And then you get the organization, which is like, she's no longer employed, right? And so this is kind of how it works. And the time, the time frame is normally not that long. I mean, this is like July 25th, and this is like, the next day, right? So this is part of the reason that people are nervous, because they're like, how much investigation and researching can you have done? Although I guess this is pretty, we have the tweet, and so maybe they feel like there's not a lot of research that we need to do. But for other people, it's an accusation, the person is denying it, or they don't think that this was actually the way that I said it. But regardless of whether it's like a blatant tweet like this or something that's a little different, the process is normally very, very quick. Okay. Now, in the process of the social regulation of speech, like all speech is treated pretty much the same. But actually, there are three different kinds of speech that get grouped together and treated in an undifferentiated way. So one is censorable speech. Censorable speech is speech that is stigmatized and considered harmful across a range of speakers with different ideological frameworks. Okay? So if you ask a person, like, is this kind of speech that kind of denigrates minorities, right, or denigrates vulnerable groups, for it to be censorable, if you ask a liberal, if you ask a conservative, if you ask an independent, if you ask a Christian, if you ask an atheist, right, if you ask a student, if you ask an old person, you will get, this idea of people saying, yes, actually this is kind of speech that is disparaging. Now, they may not agree on what should be done about it, but for censorable speech, you will have a consensus, maybe not every single person, but a consensus that includes a diverse range of people, not just people from one particular discourse community. And by discourse community, I think, people who have similar speech norms. And so that would be considered censorable. Contested speech is a category that gets treated exactly the same as censorable speech, but it is actually very different. Contested speech has two characteristics. One characteristic is that there is an influential or reasonably influential group in society that believes the speech is of high value, it's something like political speech, and it should be protected. But at the same time, there is a group in society that believes this speech is low value speech, right? It's speech that does not contribute to the discourse and the dialogue, right, and the process of self-governance. And it's speech that should be sanctioned. So it's the same speech, and one group in society views it as very valuable political speech. Another group in society views it as something akin to hate speech. Right? And so one example, you could think about Black Lives Matter, right? Some people feel like the critique of the police, right, is like this very important political speech. It's kind of trying to get policies made and kind of redress kind of a social ill. Other people feel like, no, right, this is speech that is actually making the police vulnerable to attack, right, and that it should be sanctioned, right. So that's the kind of speech I mean when I say contested speech. You can also think about kind of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right. Sometimes the critiques of Israel, right, it's like, oh my gosh, this is very important political speech from the Palestinians. Other people are like, no, this is anti-Semitism, right, that's directed at making the Jewish people more vulnerable. So that's contested speech. Discreditable speech is also treated the same as censorable speech. Discreditable speech is speech that is just rude, callous, insensitive, right? It's low value, and most people don't really defend discreditable speech. Discreditable speech is the speech people have in mind when they say it was offensive, like the way you said it, right, was just super offensive. So discreditable speech is similar to tone policing, right? And so we didn't like your tone. Whether or not this speech should be sanctioned can be contested, but once people are making accusations, they treat discreditable speech exactly the same time as censorable speech. The line between these three types of speech is not one that institutions have paid attention to. Okay, so here are some examples. This was comparing, I think it was comparing the Obamas, right, to like, this is like, I think moving day at the White House or something they said. This is Colin Kaepernick and, his kind of critique of, not gonna stand for the flag, that kind of thing. Some people thought he's a hero, right? And other people thought, oh my God, get him out of there. And this was so interesting. I could not believe this guy was fired. Okay, so the Rockets, I think, were playing the Mavericks. Okay, and so he's like with their official Twitter feed, and he says, shh, just close your eyes, they will all be over soon. And so he got fired. For one thing, he got fired for emoji violence, if you can believe it. But then other people thought this framing just sounded like, it sounded like almost like rape culture or something. And so he was fired. But, there's a way in which, I don't know, to me this seemed problematic. It didn't seem as clearly problematic as maybe the kind of, retweeting that, right? So yeah, that was that one. All right. I kind of described these three categories, and I kind of may have made it seem to you like, yes, you can clearly put things in these categories. But actually, when people bring to tweets, to Facebook posts, to interviews, they bring their own background assumptions about who's vulnerable, about what's rude, about what's insensitive. And so there's actually conflict. I believe that speech can be divided into these three categories, but I think people would disagree about what category to assign to different types of speech, which is why people are able to credibly treat all speech as kind of censorable speech. Okay, there are two kind of dominant narratives when you think about a social regulation. One is the consequence culture narrative, and the other is the cancel culture narrative. And so for almost any given speech situation that's not clearly censorable in like very meaningful ways, you will hear people invoking each one of these narratives. So consequence culture. Consequence culture makes a point that the speech is harmful. Okay, it's not offensive. It is harmful. It is injurious. Okay? To them, all speech that is being sanctioned is treated as censorable speech. The quintessential examples are like sexual harassment on Twitter, like death threats. But even though they have these quintessential examples, so they're like, we need cancel culture, we need consequence culture because sexual harassment and death threats. But then they apply the sanctions to speech that does not rise to the level of sexual harassment or death threats. So it's applied indiscriminately across speech. So this is Tara Field. She might have worked at Netflix, or maybe she just had a response to The Closer. The Closer was very controversial because of some of the jokes that were disparaging to the trans community. And so she says, you're going to hear a lot of talk about offense. We aren't complaining about being offended. What we object to is the harm that content like this does to the trans community. Right? So the discourse of consequent culture is the discourse of harm. And it's actually kind of offensive to those within that discourse community to have their objections reduced to kind of being overly sensitive and offended. Okay? The cancel culture narrative treats all the speech that is being sanctioned as contested speech or discredited, right? We're being, fired because we were, we didn't use, elite discourse, right? We were just talking ordinary, everyday jokes. Okay. There are these academics, like the free speech law people. They have a discourse that is, they don't say, we're not saying it's not censorable. So they say, we can agree that it's censorable. We can agree that it's harmful, but regulating it is more harmful than allowing. Right? But this is a discourse that you often hear among like academics. Mostly among ordinary people, a lot of times they're just like, you're just offended. I don't see what the problem is like with this speech, right? So they treat, when they think about cancel culture, when they talk about cancel culture, harassing speech, death threats, racist speech, that's kind of invisible. And what they're focused on and angry about is people are losing their jobs because this random person was offended. All right. So here's Donald Trump, spokesperson for cancel culture people. Although, of course, he has lots of people he wants to cancel. The goal of cancel culture is to make decent Americans live in fear of being fired, expelled, shamed, humiliated, and driven from society as we know it. And so the idea is this ordinary, everyday people who haven't done anything, and they end up okay, that did not come out as well as I might have liked. So what are the challenges to the kind of existence of cancel culture and to consequence culture and to trying to find some way out of this kind of box? Well, one of the ways some people say, well, let's just have free speech culture, right? Let's just support the marketplace of ideas, and that's just it. But actually, that's insufficient, right? Because you cannot have a marketplace of ideas if some people are too afraid to speak in the market. And so it's not just, on the one hand, people are like, yeah, exactly, white conservatives are afraid to speak up now. But it's not only them, right? It's also like, oh my gosh, like in some spaces it's women, in some spaces it's people of color. So you can't have a marketplace of ideas unless it's a place that's safe for people to speak. But in order to make it safe for diverse people to speak, then you have to keep other people, right, from marginalizing. So there's this tension that we want diversity and we want multiplicity of ideas, but sometimes in order to get the speakers to share those ideas, we have to protect them from verbal abuse. And so how do we do that? So that's a challenge. If there is no accountability and we just let everybody say whatever they want, you're going to be missing speakers. So I am just, even though I do all this study, I'm really not on Twitter. I have nothing to say to the Twitter mob, right? Okay, so my voice is missing from that conversation. right? Or you can have too much accountability, right? There are some people who are not on Facebook, they're on Truth Social or something, right? So they have gone into their own little silo. And so if the idea is that if accountability is designed to give us a welcoming marketplace, it doesn't work if half the people leave, right, to go and make their own little segregated silo, right? But at the same time, it also doesn't work, right, if you have people who are just silenced and not speaking at all. Okay? So you're probably all like, all right, tell us the solution. Yeah, no, I don't have a solution. I'm a person who I believe in incremental improvement, right? So it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything, but I think that there are some things that can be done to make it better. It's not going to be the best. People are still going to be canceled, but we can make it a little, less worse, right? So one of the things that happened in the kind of Netflix saga over the closer was the Netflix kind of CEO or whoever was in charge of making these statements said right off the bat, we're not pulling the show. Period. That's it. We're not going to cancel the show. Right? So that's, before you even start, the movement, this is off the table. And so, actually, people say, well, we don't want you to pull the show, right? We want you to do some diversity training. We want you to do some diversity hiring. People operated within the realm of what they thought was on the table as a possible solution, right? And so that creates an opportunity for universities and other institutions to redefine in the public mind what is possible in the social regulation of speech. If we know it's possible to get them fired, and we're really angry, we're going to be like, fire them, right? But if the university has a policy, if the institution has a policy that says, we don't fire people for these types of things, we suspend them for 2 weeks, right? Or we suspend them for 4 weeks. I mean, okay, still, if you're living from paycheck to paycheck, like a 2-week suspension is pretty bad, but it's not, the loss of your employment completely, right? So there are some ways in which institutions in this kind of, we're in a culture that is like 0 to 100, like everything is the maximum penalty right away. So we can slow that down and introduce some gradations into the public consciousness, but that's reliant on institutions responding in measured ways, right? And so one thing institutions can do, even though there is contestation around types of speech and around which category speech belongs to, they can at least begin to introduce to the public that there are different types of speech that is harmful or that is offensive, and that those different types of speech warrant different types of sanctions, right? So make some sanctions tied to the type of speech. Secondly, one of the things that has always bothered me is it's like one strike, you're out, right? And even though people have a one strike, you're out mentality, they always say, no, this is indicative. I know they've done it before, like there's probably a pattern, right? But then when you hear like the pattern, sometimes it's like strict, right? And it's really because of this one thing that they did. And so if it's a first offense, right, then I think we should treat it, right, as a first offense. Because one of the interesting things about people is, I think we create an illusion that there are people in the world who always say the right thing, right? But, so I come from a religious background, and they were like, there's no person who's never, like, sinned with their mouth, right? Like, it's impossible. And so if we kind of have this awareness, right, that there's actually no person who has never said the wrong thing, who's never spoken without thinking, right? We all know that, but in the social regulation of speech, that gets lost and is one strike, you're out. And so if institutions can begin to give people a grace period, right, where we don't do one strike, you're out, where we do look at course of conduct, we do look at how often does this happen, then I think that will also dial down some of the seriousness and just make cancel culture much less threatening. And people will be willing, I think, to engage in the conversation that's so important for democracy to function. One of the things that, bothers me, I think I tell my students all the time, I'm like, I read, I read CNN, I read Fox News, because I want to know, what are the people who disagree with me? Where are they coming from? What do they believe to be true about the state of the world, right? I think in order to compromise or govern together with people, I always tell my students, the people you dislike, they can still vote, right? There's no way for you to stop them from voting. Like, they have influence on your lives. So don't you want to know, like, what they believe and what they think? And so I think if we create kind of gradation and grace periods, we can begin to talk to each other more. That doesn't mean we're going to disagree. I mean, that we're going to agree, but we can understand where the other people are coming from. Statute of Limitations. There's so much work that goes into changing culture and changing norms, right? There are words we don't use anymore, right? And that was successful advocacy. People fought for those words not to be used anymore. But if we punish people for things that they said before those battles were even fought, right? I don't know if you guys have heard, like, they talk about change, and they're like, for change, they're always the pioneers, the first people to adopt change, and then they're the settlers, right? They adopt the change later. When we don't have a statute of limitations, we're punishing people for not being pioneers. Like, you were not, at the head of the class in adopting this new change in language and in discourse. And so I think it's very important that we want to acknowledge, right, that we successfully fought for this change, right? Because if we're punishing people for norms in the past, before those norms change, I mean, it's not actually serving a purpose. They cannot go back in time, right, and become a pioneer. And if they're no longer using that language now, it's not clear what we are accomplishing. And so it doesn't mean that you never suffer for your speech, but one of the things that I propose is that companies don't punish people for things that they said before they became employed by them, right? Because when they became employed, I'm sure whenever people join an institution, then you try to conform to the discursive norms of that institution. So I would say don't reach into the past and punish people for things that they said before you hired them. And also, 20 years, that's just too far in the past. And so just having some limits on how far back we look. I would say no more than 2 years, because things change so rapidly. One of the reasons that things change so rapidly is new groups are successfully able to get social recognition as a marginalized group, as a group that deserves some protection against disparity, right? Just the way that we talk about mental health these days is very different from the way we talked about it in the past, right? And then last, moderation. You can punish people, you can sanction them, you can use coercion to get people to adopt new norms. The coercion does not have to be, right, everybody around them drops them and, never speaks to them again, never hires them again. But there can be moderation, because if we want a marketplace of ideas, we actually don't want people to leave the marketplace. We want them to stay in the marketplace, but not be mean, right, to their fellow, speakers. And if that is what we want, then we have to have some moderation in the punishment, because otherwise people can lean into their victimhood, right? And then they're just like, these are the people who did me wrong, done me wrong. And then it's very hard for those people to be voters who are conscious that we share this country with a plurality of individuals with different lifestyles and norms. So, all right. So my students always tell me I talk really fast. She probably is like, yes, she does talk really fast. So hopefully I left enough time though for questions or comments. If anyone had a response or you have something to share, yes.
So you're with University of Wisconsin, which is literally engraved in stone, the concept of the sifting and continual fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth may be known. How is your institution doing in that regard?
So they're not doing very well, actually. I was an advisory on the advisory board of a free speech survey that we wanted to do. But people were like, oh my gosh, right? Is this like a right-wing attempt to shut? And so they didn't want us to do the surveys, and there was like a lot of back and forth about the survey. And one of the arguments of the kind of author, the kind of study author, was we are committed to sifting and winnowing, right? We don't, we don't shy away from doing that because we are afraid of the political response. But it took actually a lot of fighting and back and forth to get the survey to be back online. And I think one of the things that I am planning to do is to kind of do some interviews with adjuncts. Because there are adjuncts who have lost their jobs at the University of Wisconsin because of their speech in ways that we would not consider within the spirit of sifting and winnowing. So I feel like like most universities, there is work to be done. But I do think that there is attention to that, and that people want to do something different, but they're not yet sure of what to do. So I'm like, I have an article now.
I just want to say thank you for your talk. It was fascinating. I have a pretty specific question, I guess. So I was very interested by what you said of kind of limiting what is possible when sanctioning someone for some sort of derogatory speech. And you mentioned that, for example, someone may be cleared but then face a later consequence, or within the framework of maybe facing some sort of limited sanction, such as that 2-week suspension. But something that came to mind is that I'd imagine when that person goes back to work, they're going to feel probably some hostility from colleagues and students and people who are still hurt and angry by what they've said. And I'm wondering, do you feel, I guess, that is kind of a natural consequence of just saying mean things that shouldn't be regulated institutionally? Or do you feel that kind of that workplace tension that will inevitably follow is something that should be moderated or facilitated by said institution?
Yeah, so I think there's a limited limit to how much we can influence people, right, and change their behavior. But I think someone wrote a book like Nudging, like we kind of nudge these people in the right direction. So to a certain extent, I think that workplace tension is something that's inevitable, right? But I think given time, you can actually work through those things, right? It just depends on, does the individual have the stamina to stay, stay for the long haul? And do their colleagues who are most offended have the willingness to stay? But I think the institution, right, can try to incentivize people staying, because I think there's just something actually about interaction with individuals, right, over time that softens attitudes, and I think also builds. Sometimes it doesn't, right? But I think it's worth trying. And so I would see the institution's role as trying to keep the people from leaving, right, because the person is still there, and try to give opportunities for communities to kind of repair itself. And I saw a hand. Yes.
Yeah, you made a little joke about it or comment, I guess, with the counseling, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of because we talked about it, like it's a big line, but sort of the cancel culture discourse versus the consequence discourse, sort of the blending between the two that sometimes happens.
Yeah, so I haven't done like a controlled for variables experiment on this, but anecdotally, if the person who is speaking is saying something that you agree with, right, it's more likely that the response will be kind of a cancel culture, like don't cancel them, don't be mean to them, like they're let them have their free speech. Right? If, on the other hand, the speaker is saying something, an idea that you disagree with, right, then it's more likely that you'll say, oh my gosh, they should be punished, right? They should be sanctioned. Like there needs to be consequences for their speech. And so one of the tragedies is accusations are normally across the ideological divide, right? So it's I have this position and I accuse the person across the divide, right? And I want accountability for the person in the other discourse community, right? So it's not a people affiliate or identify with one discourse community or the other, like cancel culture or consequence culture, based many times, not always, on how they personally evaluate the speech. Is that?
Yeah, so Donald Trump getting kicked off of Twitter. So based on what you've said, if I'm interpreting it right, you're saying it would have been better really for him to stay on there and figure out how everybody can understand each other, and it could maybe be a better discourse. Well, the other point I have is a lot of people think he's saying things that aren't true, or like, so if you have somebody who's speaking things that aren't true and has a lot of influence, isn't that dangerous? Like, how does that all work?
Right. So two things. The first is not that he can't be kicked off, right? He can't be permanently named, right? So maybe we have to have, because they're like, just never let him be on Twitter again. I think that's, the extreme, right? Can we have some kind of like, you're banned for 2 months, right? You come back, maybe you're doing the same behavior, maybe you're banned for 3 months, right? So it's a process. It's not a one and done. Now, in terms of the danger, I'm not sure. Okay, so some people, they have the view that I would rather know what Trump is telling his followers, right? I can see that on Twitter. I have no idea what people are hearing on Truth Social. None whatsoever. So if you know the falsities that are being put out there, you can take some steps and you can try to like add some, fact checking. I think at one point they were like putting little things like this is not true or like, So, you can kind of have some counter speech there, right? Because they're in the equivalent of a marketplace, right? Where there are complete sites. But on Truth Social, there's no one, right, doing a little fact check. And so to me, that seems more dangerous than the Twitter. Although with Truth Social is a smaller group, so, people can disagree about that.
At the risk of giving you another article to write, you're talking today, and very nice presentation by the way, about reactive kinds of speech. And what about banning books and keeping speakers from campuses? And can you address some of that? Because that's really not, that's, I'm a former publisher, so I would never ban a book unless you want everyone to read it.
Yeah.
So how would you take this kind of incremental approach to the campuses where they're saying, well, we're a liberal campus, we don't want anyone to stay with a different perspective, or books that are banned, whether they're from schools or from libraries?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that I like social regulation over legal regulation is that it's partial, right? So if you don't have the book in the library, that doesn't mean, right, that the book is completely inaccessible, right? You have other avenues. You can buy the book for your child, right? You can, find it at, some other place. And so in that respect, I'm not in favor of banning books, but I also think it's a limited, more political, right, kind of stance. The actual impact, I'm not sure, because some people are like, who actually reads physical books these days anyway? Right? I don't know, maybe people do, but I think there's a oh my gosh, come on! Oh no, some libraries have to do that. Okay, so we're in a library. I think, I think that there is like a limited effect and limited scope of the banning of the book. And I think it's primarily a political statement. I think the impact of the statement and the impact of the actual banning, I don't think they're comparable. As to, do we fight against the banning? I think so. I mean, I feel like, if you're the public library, I feel like people have impact and influence. And so they have to use their voice to challenge that. But if it's a community, and the majority of the community is on board with like banning this book, then I don't see how you, unless you just want to dominate that community, I don't see what you do. I think you have to just make it available for the dissenters in other ways. And I think you said to universities, maybe there was a second part.
I was talking about, I think there's a thing about comedians who don't want to go to college campuses because nobody can take a joke anymore, or that you don't want someone from an opposite political ideology of you coming to your campus, and so that they've barred speakers from coming.
Yeah, and
so
I
much
think,
for sifting and
yeah, I think universities have to take a stronger line on that, because I would hear like the free speech, absolutists are always like, you don't want to hear the speaker, don't listen. Why are you stopping other people? And I do understand this idea that some speech is extremely harmful. I think I would not have a blanket answer, like always allow the speakers, always don't allow them. but I would say universities need to have discussion with their institution. Like sometimes it's like two extreme groups, right? Like one group is like wants to be provocative and invite them, and the other group is also extreme on the opposite way, and they want to like use their bodies to block them. But I feel like campuses have a whole enormous population that is not always involved, right, in that discourse, in that debate, that might be a moderating influence. And so I think before universities take action, they should try to get a sense of, outside of these two extremes, where are the rest of the people? And if they, you need to try and get to some of the middle people. They still exist. They don't get the kind of airtime, right, that the extreme people do. And I think trying to allow that to be a moderating influence, I think would be very helpful. That's what I would suggest.
What are your thoughts about like lower level educational cancel culture in the sense of the political reasons behind why they're doing it, insofar as a lot of it seems to be for the promotion of the development of charter schools? Specifically, there's a charter school system based out of Michigan called Hilldale College, which I know makes one think that these would be colleges, but in fact they have lower level, like elementary and secondary education charter schools that they're trying to set up like in New York and Florida, and they are headed by Betsy DeVos's brother. I know this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. And they received a lot of funding under the Trump administration, and they are in fact behind a lot of the movements, like in Florida, like the Don't Say Gay bill and things like that. And so I was thinking, like with the book bannings and things like that. A lot of times these laws, I think, have these secondary political purposes, and I was just wondering what, kind of what your thoughts are on these sort of political school cancel culture things that are happening.
Yeah, I think education is a tricky thing, and it's tricky for a couple of reasons. There's a common interest on both sides. People want to pass their culture on to their children, right? And that's, I think, normal and human, and nothing extreme about it. Except people's cultures are very different, and some cultures say it's bad to be this and it's bad to be that, right? But it happens on both sides, right? Like you have like the religious fundamentalists, oh my God, it's bad to be that, right? Or you're a member of the LGBT, oh, it's bad to be that. So you have these competing groups who want to pass their culture on to their children, but they can't. And so this is where charter schools come in. I don't know the solution, but I think to a certain degree we have to allow people to make their safe spaces to pass their culture on. Do I want them to like create political chaos and confusion while they're doing that? No. But I think the first step is let them make their safe spaces, but then the second step is how do we make these competing groups feel safe in society, right? People are feeling like their identity is under threat. What is it about our norms and our systems that are making two very different groups both feel that their identities are under threat? And so then I think as a society, maybe we have to, these are symptoms, right, of this problem. So I don't know what we can do about the system. I think we just have to let them, do that. But I think we have to find a way to create some kind of security for these identities. I think both groups want social recognition, right? And so how do we give them social recognition at the same time without requiring people to give up their identity? Like, I don't want to give you social recognition at the expense of my identity, and I don't want to make you give me social recognition at the expense of your identity. And so it's the same thing. How do we do pluralism, right? And so, yeah, I don't know if that's a full answer, but it's a complicated thing. But I would prefer them not to use the political process to fight that out.
I'm thinking, cancel culture is actually not something that I've heard of before. And so thank you for bringing this up. And the example I'm thinking of is in the Madison School District. The previous superintendent made a blanket statement that you cannot use the N-word for Black people in our schools. you say that out loud, you will be fired. And she did so. There were more than 3 teachers that lost their jobs, one of whom was reading a book and used the word. And I think what I'm hearing from you is like extremes are bad. That, you know, this sort of blanket, you're fired, done. My first reaction was, well, I don't want my kids exposed to the N-word. That word makes me feel very uncomfortable. And then I got the album Cardi B from the library. And oh, if you have not heard Cardi B, I would call her a rapper, and every other word is the N-word, and I'm like, I can't listen to this. And one of my coworkers was like, you're never gonna be able to appreciate black music if you can't listen to Cardi B. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so I don't know where's the balance there.
So this is why cancel culture is so difficult, because language is difficult, right? And so the basic rule, right, is that black people can use the N-word, white people cannot, right? That's the rule, right? And so if one of the teachers who was fired for the N-word was black, it would be a big deal because they feel like it's okay, he's kind of reclaiming, the word. I don't think it's a word that can be reclaimed, but clearly, people like Cardi B think it can. So that's one of the challenges. And so one of the challenges is it's like a double standard, right? There's some things, and then there's like this idea that you could be racist if you denigrate black people, if you're not racist if you're like all white people are devils, right? That's true. And then there's so that there's this double standard. And so because of that, you're going to alienate people who don't buy into the double standard and who want it to be the same. And I think people have reasons, right? I think there are historical reasons, there are social reasons, there are cultural reasons why there would be a double standard. But I think for institutions, right, you have some people who want the double standard and you have some people who feel it's unfair. So that's why I think institutions have to find a balance. And one way to find that balance is not to go to the extremes. Because if you fire the black teacher, that's horrible. If you fire the white teacher, but you don't fire the black teacher, that creates confusion. If you kind of have a more balanced approach, you can actually put sanctions on both of them, right? But maybe it doesn't make people as angry because it's temporary and yes.
I'm a longtime supporter of the American Civil Liberties Union, and they always used to say the cure for bad speech is more speech. I understand that in recent years they've sort of backed away from that. Could you address that?
I'm glad they backed away from that. There was an article, I wish I had had the wisdom to write it. And he said, originally we had a problem with scarcity of speakers, right? And so we were like, let's not silence the few speakers we have. Let's get more speakers into the marketplace. People would argue that today, we have cheap speech. There are too many people saying whatever they want to say and confusing everybody. So we have way more speakers, but people have the same amount of time, right? So you have like a quadruple, quintuple, I don't even know, right? You have so many more speakers, but you do not have more hours in a day, which means that people are no longer even listening. Like they're just like, oh, retweet this because I like that person, they tweeted it, I'm gonna retweet it, and there is no engagement with the content. And so the idea that we're not, that we're recognizing that more speech may not be the answer because we already have too much, that I think that's good. And I think it also reflects an awareness that not all speech is equal, right? So I would love to be able to there was people who did something to me. Facebook actually took down one of my posts. And I was so angry, and I tweeted, "Look at Facebook taking down my post," and no one had a reaction because I have 10 followers. Right? So that's not everyone has the ability to do effective counter speech, right? You need actually a platform to do effective counter speech. And so the idea that you can just have counter speech, no. Sometimes people who have the most effective counter speech, a lot of times are people with power and with access, right? And so if that's not equal, counter speech is not going to help the marginalized person, because their counter speech is not going to have the same impact as the kind of big platform person with 100 followers who did the first offensive speech.
Have any of the people who lost their jobs for misusing certain terms got lawyers and got their jobs back?
Yes, so some of them have gotten lawyers and have gotten their job back, and some of them got lawyers and didn't lose their job in the first place. But then it makes people angry because there's this one woman at Penn, Amy Wax, right? And so she said horrible things about students, according to different sources. And so she couldn't really be fired, and so now she's like a professor with her salary, but she doesn't have to deal with students. I'm like, wait, that's a reward. I love my students, and I'm recording. So some people have had modified duties, right, that kind of try to take them out of the space and the rank of whoever they offended. Other people have actually not gotten their jobs back. They've gotten like a lump sum of money. The one guy, I think he took his job back. He was a professor. I can't call the college, but he refused to use the preferred pronoun of some of his students, right? And so he went through a lot of things, but I feel like he actually got his job back and he's still working. Some of the things you hear is kind of, I think one person had a question about this, is that they are isolated within their workplace, right? No one wants to deal with them, no one likes them, people are not collegial with them, so they're kind of just still there, still getting their job, but they are in it's almost like they have the scarlet letter, on them. So even though they still have their job, the quality of their life and their job many times has changed. I don't know people who've actually kind of gotten their job back and still felt like their quality of life was the same. I think most of the time, a lot of them end up, even if they get their job back, they leave and they go to a different institution. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's a kind of, if they were at a prestigious institution or something, it's a kind of step down in their career path. But it's because even if they get their job back, you can't, all of the things that have been said and done, and people have half-truths about you, it can be a very tense place. But they have been successful in getting their job back. This one.
Let me know if this is like outside your scope, but in general, you've been talking sort of like speak to all of the public. I was wondering if you could talk briefly just about like this same dynamic that as it applies to sort of a counter-public or just marginalized communities speaking within themselves that would then have the same dynamic, but then sort of speech being seen as too much of that community.
So when you say, so you're talking about like, I think if you're kind of a smaller discourse community, then maybe it's not a marketplace of ideas, right? Because you really want people to be on the same page and in lockstep. And so I found kind of counter-public, to use that phrase, may tend to be very harsh. Like you're just not a member, right? Like the people who are a member of this particular discourse community, we all use these kind of norms, right? We all follow these norms. So if you are refusing to follow those norms, you are not actually a member of the discourse community. And I think if you're like a small group and that's your identity, then I think you get to push people out. But that's normally not your job many times. Like sometimes it's like more like a social community. If it's actually your work, then I think that's a little bit harder to do for workplaces to require some kind of ideological hegemony. Seems to be a little bit problematic, actually.
In the worlds of business, religion, military, government, nonprofit organizations, the general rule of thumb is, unless you're unionized, is employment at will. But in academia, you've got this concept called tenure. Is this a threat to tenure? Is tenure a threat to this?
So as I told you, sometimes the most vulnerable people are the pre-tenure people, like me, and the adjuncts, right? Because they actually don't. So not everyone on the campus has tenure. There is just a small, increasingly, the percentage of professors on campus who are teaching who have tenure is like shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So it's just like a few people who have tenure. It's very difficult sometimes to fire those people. So then they end up like Amy Wax, where they're just kind of like ostracized by their peers and they don't have interaction with students. So is this a challenge to tenure? It's a challenge if it goes beyond just social and it becomes written into law, right? Like a lot of universities now are, well, not a lot, but Texas, Georgia, Florida, they're getting rid of tenure, right? And so if there's a sense that professors are engaged in some kind of violation of speech norms, and that becomes kind of institutionalized into law to where we get rid of tenure, then it is a threat in that way. But I think for most universities, tenure is still a bit of a protection against being fired for your speech. But the challenge is people can have pretexts. And so there are ways to kind of get around tenure. Like tenure does, like it means, that we won't fire you for certain things, but we can still fire you for like bad behavior. And so I feel like there was one guy in Princeton, and they were like maybe like a decade before he had dated a student, right? And they had already sanctioned him or whatever for dating the student. But when he had a speech infraction, they went back to that decades-old thing. And so even if you have tenure, it's very difficult to live a perfect life. And so I think people can always find something. So yes, I think it can be a threat to tenure. Maybe not directly, because they will kind of on the surface have to give lip service, like you have tenure, you have academic freedom, blah blah blah. But I think if they open the box and they go to find something, like, oh, you didn't do your taxes. I don't know. They could always, there's always something if people dig enough and they're motivated enough, they can find something, and that can actually lead to you being fired without tenure. So long answer, but short answer is yes, it can be a threat to tenure. Okay. I think
Thank you all so much for coming and for your great questions. And let's give another round of applause for our speakers today. Thank you so much. This was really informative, and we really appreciate it. And I would encourage all of you to go upstairs and check out the book. Thank you so much, and have a great night.
Thank you.